Shalom and welcome to Minhag Dirigo, a Jewish Maine podcast. Today we're kicking off the first episode in a short series that we're calling Artificially Intelligent. Over the next few weeks, we're going to explore artificial intelligence through a Jewish ethical and moral lens. But before we can talk about ethics, we need to make sure we're tracking uh, about the same thing when we say AI. So today is about understanding artificial intelligence, at least as it exists here and now. So before we dive in, my professional background matters a little bit here. Many of you know me as the longtime president of Congregation Beth Israel in Bangor, if you're a member of the Jewish community in Maine. Also, I'm making this podcast as an extension of my rabbinical studies with the Pluralistic Rabbinical Seminary. I'm looking forward to Semicha at the end of the year. And before that, as many of you know, I retired after a 30-year span in uniform from active duty Army as a paratrooper to the Army National Guard as a logistician. But my primary vocation, the thing that has paid my bills for most of my adult life, is engineering, specifically software engineering and data science and data analytics. I currently work as an executive, a vice president in the healthcare industry in orbit around health technology, where my focus sits right now at the intersection of software, data, and decision making. And interestingly, my experience with computing goes way back to the early 1980s. I learned how to program on a Spectrum ZX Spectrum, Kpro 2X, and a Commodore 64. By age 10, I was writing in C, BASIC, and Pascal. And not long after that, I was writing assembly code for the Zilog Z80 processor. You know, if you wanted to run, maybe you guys will remember this if you're old enough, bulletin board systems. To run that, you had to compile your own application with the Hayes modem protocols built in. And it's not a brag. It's just one of those things. It was my hobby along with musicianship. And I think it was my father's goal to set me on a path that would put the kosher meat on the table for my family, even though we were vegetarians. In handing me a computer that was made in 1983 and already on its way to obsolescence at the time, as Digital Research's CPM, that was the operating system on this computer, lost the battle to Microsoft's MS DOS, the implied task ended up being that I learned how to code so I could stretch the capabilities of a machine with a 64 kilobyte RAM ceiling and software that had to fit on one of those 360K floppy disks. One of my first real projects was trying to write a drawing program for the Kpro, which, if you know anything about the Kpro, was ambitious. And here's why this story matters. Computers today make a lot of things look effortless, especially math. Floating point math, which is how digital systems have traditionally handled real numbers, i.e., numbers with decimal points. Back then, not so much. These 8-bit processors, the Z80 in my Kpro or the 6502 in the Commodore 64, they didn't support floating point math in hardware. If you wanted it, you either emulated it slowly in software or you bought an optional math coprocessor. IBM had the famous 8087 coprocessor. You could drop it in this chip on your board if it had a socket for it. The IBM PCs did. Motorola added to its 68,000 series processors as a math coprocessor, and that's a processor set that was in the early Macs, Macintoshes, Amigas, Atari ST. Today, this isn't common, though conceptually we're using GPUs at least in superficially similar ways. It's a graphic processing unit. They first came to the fore with how we'd handle Bitcoin mining. There's a lot of data involved in Bitcoin mining, and there's a lot of data involved in training AI. And offloading those tasks also off of CPUs and onto GPUs it works a lot like math coprocessors did back in the day. Conceptually, not technically. So when I wanted to draw a straight line on a screen, something that requires real numbers for precision, the processor on this computer couldn't afford the math. Again, I had 64 kilobytes of RAM on a 4 megahertz processor that was already handling disk input and output, memory addressing, screen rendering. Adding floating point arithmetic would have made it unusable. So I had to cheat. I used integers, and with integers comes approximations and close enough math. And when you're drawing lines on a screen that's only 100 by 160 pixels, close enough really is enough. But To figure that out, there was no Google back then. I had to go to the public library. I found a book on algorithms and learned Bresenham's line algorithm. And why am I telling you this? Of course, because AI, artificial intelligence, has always lived inside of constraints. And understanding those constraints matters when we talk about what AI can and cannot do. Most of what we know of AI has existed theoretically for 80 years, but the hardware has seldom been up to the task of the theory. And even now, as we build new data centers, we reactivate dormant nuclear plants and drive up the cost of energy further, it's clear that the efficiency of AI does not measure up to its actual practical applications. And we'll get into some of these ethical considerations later in the series. Artificial intelligence, though, it didn't begin with ChatGPT. Here's a straightforward textbook definition. Artificial intelligence is the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. And that includes things like decision making, speech recognition, and language translation. All of that existed, at least in primitive form, decades ago. Back in the Commodore 64 era, some of you may remember a program called ELIZA. It was created at MIT in 1965 by Dr. Joseph Weizenbaum, and it was later ported to home computers like the Commodore 64. ELIZA used early natural language processing. It didn't understand you, but it could pattern match what you said against scripts and respond in a way that kind of felt human. And even then, people were already really uncomfortable with it. So modern AI, circling back to floating point math, it depends heavily on floating point math. And you will hear terms when you get into it, like flops, floating point operations, and words like gigaflop or petaflop. In AI, flops, floating point operations, are often used to estimate how expensive it is to run a model, to push data through a neural network. Those kinds of operations were completely out of reach for early machines, which meant that AI was narrow, constrained, and fragile. But the ideas were there. And just to understand the difference between computing then and computer now, it used to be that when you wrote software for an older 8-bit computer, it the execution took place in linear sequential terms. So do this, then do this. If this condition is met, do this, and then move on to this. Modern processors have the capability of running a lot of those kinds of sequential executions in parallel. Or they can put a higher throughput, like running a floating point arithmetic complex one equation through my old Z80 processor would have stalled it perhaps and crawled to a really slow crawl. Today, my iPhone in my pocket can do 15 trillion flops, floating point operations in a single second, just to give you a sense of scale. And it's running on a battery power as opposed to being plugged in at 120 volts AC. So that's crazy. So let's define a few more terms. Machine learning is the use of computer systems to learn and adapt without being explicitly programmed by finding patterns in data. Let's go back again to the 1980s for a classic example. Terence Sejnowski and Charles Rosenberg created a system called NetTalk. They trained it on English words and their pronunciations. After training, it could correctly pronounce words it had never seen before. Now, mind you, they didn't do this on home computers. Even in the 1980s, it took mini computers or mainframes to provide enough computational power to quantize the words and make this workable. The system used what's called back propagation, and that's an algorithm that adjusts a neural network by working backward from its errors. This was a big deal. It showed that learning systems could improve themselves. And it also helped end the first major artificial intelligence winter, a period from the late 1960s to about 1980 when funding dried up because expectations had wildly outpaced reality. And when I say that, what I mean is the hardware wasn't sufficient to the task in a lot of cases. We had good theories, good understanding of how we might do something, but the hardware couldn't match it. Natural language processing, which is when a computer can parse the meaning of language, that turned out to be more complex than we thought it would be. And then there was such a finite limit to any practical applications for this early artificial intelligence that there was no profit motive to speak of. So AI didn't fail per se, and in this winter, it just ran into physics, math, and economics. And at this point, we're going to take a break and hear from one of our sponsors.
Are you looking for a great synagogue? Join us at Maine's oldest continuously operating Jewish institution, Congregation Beth Israel on 144 York Street in Bangor. We are a vibrant, egalitarian, and progressive Jewish community. We welcome Jews from all backgrounds, their partners, families, and those seeking to live Jewishly. We empower our members to live joyful and meaningful lives through prayer, learning, community friendships, and the Jewish imperative of Tikkun Olam, repair of the world. Come to a Shabbat service at 10 a.m. on Saturday, stay for food and friendship. Visit us at www.cbisrael.org to learn more.
And we're back. Great. Well, so we're going to move on to what a neural network is. I've used that term a couple of times now, and they tend to imagine something vaguely brain like and mysterious when you say it. So let's demystify it a little bit. At its core, a neural network is just a very large collection of tiny decision makers, each one asking a very simple question. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to decide whether an email is spam. You don't ask one big question, you ask lots of little ones, right? Does it contain certain words like Nigerian prince, you know, or we'd like to deposit this money in your bank account? Is the sender a known person? Do you know them? Does it have suspicious links like misspelled Microsoft or whatever? And does it look like other spam that I've ever seen before? Each of those questions gives a small nudge towards a final decision. And a neural network just kind of works the same way. Each neuron is just a tiny mathematical function, a flop, if you will, that takes an input, weighs it, and passes something along. But one neuron doesn't know anything meaningful in your brain. But when you layer thousands or millions or billions of them together, patterns begin to emerge. And that's the key idea. Intelligence emerges from lots of very dumb parts working together. So fast forward here, and let's get into deep learning. Deep learning is a specific kind of machine learning. It uses multi-layered neural networks to extract increasingly complex features from data. And the theory has been around for decades. But the real breakthrough came in 2012 with AlexNet, which dramatically improved image recognition and then set the stage for things that came along later. And the difference wasn't ideas, it was computing power and data. Let's compare. I could stall my 8-bit Z80 with one floating point calculation. I said that, and I talked about before how your average iPhone can do 15 trillion floating point operations per second. That advance was so significant, and the availability of this kind of compute power running off a lithium battery should help you understand how far things have come in 40 years. But it's also a matter of storage. My first computer with a hard drive had a whopping 10 megabyte hard drive. And back then they used to organize it, they described that amount of data as how many lines of text that you could have. Today you think about the volumes of training data that you're using for AI, all the things that happen all the time, encyclopedias, books, social media activity, all of this is going to train artificial intelligence all the time. So it's processing power and storage. That's what's at work here. And the last definition, well, not the last, but one of the other definitions I want to give you before we go too much further is a large language model, or LLM. And this is a specific application of deep learning, and it's focused on, well, language. Here's the simplest way to think about it, and hopefully this is the simplest way to think about it. An LLM is a system trained to answer one question over and over again. Given everything I've seen so far, what word is most likely to come next? That's the root function of an LLM. And that's it. It doesn't know facts the way humans do. It doesn't reason the way we reason. It predicts. And it predicts using a really enormous context. And again, you have this neural network underpinning it where with billions of examples of how language tends to flow. When you think of an LLM, when you ask it a question, it doesn't look up an answer. It generates a response one token at a time based on probability. And that's why it can sound fluent, persuasive, even insightful, and still be 100% wrong. It's not lying. It's just guessing very, very confidently. And it's not self aware. And we'll get into that. It doesn't know that it's wrong. And that's what makes it so damn complicated. So we usually do talk about AI in two ways: what it does and how capable it is. First, let's talk about functionality. Reactive machines are the simplest. They respond to inputs but don't remember the past. They've been with us the longest. A good example that a lot of people know about is IBM's Deep Blue. And this was the machine that beat Garry Kasparov at chess. It had one function: to play chess. Uh, Basic spam filters that look up spam based on words and say, this word combination is spam. Let's flag it. Smart thermostats are an example of a reactive machine. Privacy masking on security cameras. So if you have a camera that's pointed at a city street, you're monitoring traffic, but somebody's kitchen window appears in the shot, what you can do is it'll actually blur out that part of the image, and that's AI. It's boring, it's safe, and it's everywhere. Next is limited memory AI. These systems use small amounts of historical data to make decisions. Self-driving cars, recommendation engines, like if you buy a product on Amazon and all of a sudden it comes back and says, oh, here, you might also like other customers have bought. That's limited memory AI. Chatbots. So large language models fall into this category, even though they feel more sophisticated than they are. And then there's this theory of mind AI, systems that can reason about human intentions and mental states. We really don't have this yet, though LLMs are really good at mimicking it. And there is a big difference between actual reasoning and AI can pick up, if it's listening to you, it can hear inflections that indicate emotion. It can be trained for that. It can also pick up on words that you use that indicate frustration or happiness, and it can respond accordingly. But those personalities of chatbots are really, really just heuristic responses. They're not true theory of mind. And finally, the distant horizon is self-aware AI, which is self-explanatory and it remains science fiction. But here's the important part: we don't need self-aware AI for things to go very, very, very wrong. So, but to understand that and to understand LLMs a little bit better, it helps to understand something much older called Markov chains. A Markov chain is a way of modeling systems where the next step depends only on the current step, not the entire history. Here's a human example. If I say peanut butter and, you're probably saying jelly in your mind, right? That's not because you understand the concept of peanut butter. It's because you've seen that word pairing thousands and thousands of times. That's a Markov process. So Andrei Markov was a Russian mathematician working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was interested in probability and not just isolated events, but sequence of events. And his insight was this: sometimes to predict what comes next, you don't need the whole past. You just need the present. Markov originally demonstrated this by analyzing poetry. I think he used Eugene Onegin, and he looked at sequences of vowels and consonants to see how likely one was to follow another. He did this analog on paper. No meaning, no understanding, just patterns. And how this connects to LLMs today: early text generators used simple Markov chains. They would work like this: look at the last word, choose the next word based on probabilities, repeat. The result was often hilarious and it was nonsense. And of course, modern large language models are not simple Markov chains, but they are their intellectual descendants. And that's why I like to tell people about Markov chains. They're, instead of looking at one word, LLMs again look at hundreds of thousands of tokens of content and context, using those neural networks. And instead of simple probabilities, they're trained on these massive data sets. So, but the core idea remains: language is modeled as a probabilistic sequence. LLMs do not understand the meaning the way humans do. They understand likelihood. And that's why they're so powerful and so dangerous. Because when a system is optimized to sound right rather than be right, hallucinations aren't a bug, they're a feature. And once you understand that modern AI systems are fundamentally probabilistic, not moral, not conscious, not sentient, not value driven, you begin to understand why alignment isn't a technical problem, it's a human one. And AI hallucinations, which we just talked about, these are confidently wrong answers that are based off of probability and not fact, can be deadly in healthcare. You may or may not be aware of IBM's Watson in healthcare, particularly Watson for oncology. It was going to be this like, it was going to revolutionize diagnostic computing and assist oncologists by analyzing all of this patient data, and they could seamlessly integrate into other clinical workflows. It was amazing, and it consistently failed to deliver any useful or actionable insights. And it was a huge financial loss and damaged the credibility of analogous efforts. And I'd like to highlight this for a reason. A lot of my work has been in orbit around CKD and cardiac rhythm management and stuff in the last several years. And if you go to any Northern Lights, if you live here in Maine and you go to Northern Light for your primary care provider, you will see a little piece of paper in a window that's the window at the check-in or check-out that says, your data, your healthcare data, your procedures, your labs, your charts, anything, your diagnoses, these all your pharmacy subscriptions, everything, prescriptions, they all go to Commonwealth. They get submitted to Commonwealth. Well, there are these things called health information exchanges, and Commonwealth is kind of lives in that world. Quality health information networks, where I can subscribe to another service that aggregates that data on a patient by patient basis and pull that data down and use it myself. And the company I used to work for was doing this from a broker called Health Gorilla. We would pull down data from Commonwealth and Health Exchange and others, and we would also get data from various. We'd operate in certain states, so we'd get Pennsylvania's HIEs, Geisinger's HIEs in Pennsylvania, very Ohio's HIEs, and we would take patient data, not de-identified patient data. It all had your HIPAA protected stuff, and we could take it and we could use generative AI to figure out. I'm going to look at all your A1Cs across the last several years and figure out, oh yeah, you may be, at risk of chronic kidney disease, or a cardiac episode is looming for you. And that's the kind of stuff that we get into with the ethics of AI. Is like, you know it certainly it has the potential to save lives if it doesn't fail abysmally like Watson does. But we were working closely with organizations like Brandeis or Johns Hopkins to vet our models. I mean, it wasn't like we just threw something over the wall of our own design. These are things that we were working with academia and clinicians to figure out, this data is viable and usable. These end results, these diagnoses that we're making, are actually worth looking at and not hallucinated. That was the big thing, making sure that we had a way to trap hallucinations instead of just throwing stuff at patients. It was revolutionary, and it is revolutionary. It's fantastic. It lets you identify huge population health segments that you can tackle. You can under chronically underserved patient demographics. We can identify and get them into preventative care. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. But is it ethical? Because there is a profit motive. We do these things to save lives, but we also make money doing it. We get paid by Medicare. It's a good thing, but it's also, it can be cynical. So those are the questions that we have to ask. But then there's the bias in the training data that can reinforce injustice at scale. And we're going to get into a lot more details about these ethical considerations, but I wanted to, kind of end with this example before we go into describing what alignment is. I've worked on machine learning systems used in healthcare, finance, and supply chain. I don't worry about Skynet. I worry about cumulative harm. Years ago, I worked on a project to assist in judicial sentencing. The goal was fairness and transparency. And we discovered something chilling. The system amplified existing bias, just like we saw with Grok and anti-Semitism from Elon Musk's offering. Because urban offenders had more recorded interactions with law enforcement, the model consistently recommended harsher sentences for black defendants. And the reasons for this were multifaceted, but there were things that we could point to in the data, in the study, in the simulations that we could turn over to people that were interested. And number one was that if you were poor and lived in an urban setting, you had earlier and more frequent interactions with law enforcement, which meant you had more consistent entry points to the criminal justice system than you would as a suburban or rural person, poor or rich, whatever. And and so that broken windows policing was one possible vector. Another one was if your city has a revenue dependency, and many cities do this. They create, how do we fund our cities? Some of it comes off of the back of summary offensive enforcement, like parking violations or minor harassment, little things like that. And unpaid bench warrants, all this stuff. It has a cumulative effect on your dockets and the stuff you have in your judicial profile. The AI wasn't racist; the data was. And this brings us to AI alignment, and that is making sure that AI systems reflect human values and ethics. Here's the problem: humanity doesn't have a consistent agreement. We don't have consensus on hardly any of these values. And worse, when we do have values, we don't live up to them. So broken systems train broken models, which is why theologians, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, whatever, must understand AI deeply before commenting on it. I get really annoyed when I see rabbis talking about, can I count a sentient AI for minion? That's a useless question. And if I sound a little hot about this, I am. It's aggravating. It's stupid. It's a waste of time because we are not even remotely close to that. In the meantime, questions like, hey, Rabbi, what is an ethical use of my healthcare data? That's not a useless question. So that's where we're going to pick up next time. What are the real ethical dilemmas that AI presents? And what should a Jewish response formally look like? Thank you again for joining me on Minhag Dirigo. You can learn more at minhagdirigo.com. Follow us on YouTube and Facebook, and send us your questions. We would love to hear from you. Whatever channel you can get a hold of me, I'd love it. I love it. Our music is provided by the Schmutz Family Gefelte Revival Band. Catering is by my wife, Leah. Yeah. And moral support, as always, is by my dog, Bram, and my daughter, Nezzy. Shalom, Maine.